All right, let's dive into a really fascinating legal puzzle, one that connects the old school Victorian stock market right to the investment app on your phone. We're going to uncover a 150-year-old rule that decides when a lie can cost someone millions and when, believe it or not, it might be perfectly legal.
So picture this. You're kicking back, watching some financial news, and a CEO comes on. They're super confident, talking up their company, saying it's the next big thing. You're sold. You think, wow, this is it. You pull out your phone, open your trading app, and buy a bunch of stock. And then, poofs, the whole thing collapses. Your investment gets wiped out, and it turns out that CEO might have been, let's say, exaggerating a little. So what's your first move? You want to sue, right? I mean, they lied and you lost your money. Seems like a total slam dunk. But what if I told you that you probably can't sue? And the reason why is way more complex and honestly way more interesting than you might think. Yep, the answer to this very modern problem is actually buried in a legal principle that was set in stone over a century and a half ago. To really get it, we've got to go back in time. Okay, but before we get into the whole courtroom drama, we have to wrap our heads around the key legal idea here. It's a concept that really changes the whole game. The term you gotta know is intended representee. Now, it sounds all formal and legalese, but the idea is actually super simple. You can only sue somebody over a false statement if you were the person they were trying to talk to. It all comes down to the intended audience. So, it all boils down to this one simple question. Who was the statement actually meant for? Just keep that question in your head because it's the key that unlocks this entire story. And that story is the huge landmark case of Peek versus Gurney. This is where that abstract idea got hammered into actual solid law. So let's fire up the time machine. The year is 1873. We're in Great Britain, in the House of Lords, which back then was the highest court in the entire country. So who are the main characters in our little drama? Well, on one side, we've got Mr. Peek. He's an investor. And on the other side, we have the directors of a company called Overend, Gurney and Company. And they had just put out a document called a prospectus to raise some cash. And that document, the prospectus, is right at the center of this whole mess. So what exactly was it, and who is it for? Okay, so here's the problem. The company's prospectus was just full of misleading stuff. It made the business seem way more successful than it actually was. But, and this is the absolute key detail, it was only sent directly to a very specific group of people, the first wave of potential investors. And this creates a huge divide. See, the intended audience was that first group, the folks who got the prospectus in the mail and were invited to buy brand new shares, fresh from the company. But Mr. Peek, he was in a totally different boat. He bought his shares way later on the open stock market from someone who was in that first group. So the company inevitably goes belly up, Mr. Peek loses all his money, and he sues the directors. The case goes all the way to the top court. So how are the lords going to rule? The court came up with an absolutely brilliant metaphor to explain their thinking. They said the prospectus was like a gunshot. It was aimed at a very specific target, those initial investors, and once it hit that target, once they bought the shares, its job was done. The statement didn't, follow the bullet out into the open market. So let's just break down that logic. Step 1, the prospectus was an invitation just for the original buyers. That's it. Step 2, its purpose was complete the second those shares were sold. And that leads to Step 3, the directors only had a duty to be truthful to that first original intended audience. And all of that led to the final verdict. Because Mr. Peek bought his shares on the secondary market, he was not an intended representee of the prospectus. The lie wasn't told to him. And because of that, he had no legal right to sue. Case closed. Now, that's a pretty wild piece of legal history, right? But what does it have to do with that CEO on TV we were talking about at the start? Well, it turns out the echo of this 150-year-old decision is absolutely everywhere in our modern financial world. The legacy here is just massive. The principle that was set back in 1873 became the bedrock for modern securities law. It's the reason why we have rules about who companies are legally responsible to when they issue official documents, like IPO filings or reports to the SEC. The big takeaway is this. It creates a bright, clear line. There's a huge legal difference between the specific binding promises a company makes in a formal document to a specific group of investors and the optimistic, off-the-cuff stuff a CEO might say on TV.
Without this line, the markets could be pure chaos. Any company that ever sold a stock could face an endless stream of lawsuits from anyone who ever bought a share. This rule brings stability and creates a clear boundary for who's responsible to whom.
And all this leaves us with a really fascinating question for today. In our world, a world of social media where a single tweet from a CEO can send a stock price to the moon or into the gutter in seconds, who exactly is the intended audience? Is it still a neat and tidy group, or has that line been blurred for good? It's a 150-year-old question facing a very, very modern challenge.